Well, first, I would point out that I think in the discussions in Riyadh between the American and Russian delegations have actually gone pretty well. I think both sides are getting into the details of how you normalize relations. So I don't think there is necessarily any obstacle in Riyadh at the negotiating table. The obstacles are elsewhere. The biggest obstacle, of course, is Mr. Zelensky and his government, which is frankly judged to be both unreliable in any case and unalterably opposed to any agreement which does not restore the status quo ante, which is not going to happen. So I think that's a problem. The other problem is you still have people inside the United States who insist on seeing Russia as some sort of Soviet-like opponent. The usual mythologies about Mr. Putin's aspirations to rule all of Europe and all this kind of thing are still out there. This makes it very hard on the president. I think to some extent the president needs a supporting public relations campaign to attack all of these fraudulent statements and mythological obsessions with Putin and so forth. Now, the Ukrainian side is a serious problem. And of course, as you know, they're being reinforced certainly by London and Paris, and to a lesser extent by Berlin. I don't see anything good happening as long as Mr. Zelensky is there. And so that's why I think we're now hearing rumblings about an interim government in Ukraine, something with which both we and the Russians can work with.
But if Donald Trump, comes to his senses and picks up the phone and calls you today for advice, so what would you recommend as a way forward to bring an end to this horrible war?
I think there should be a concerted effort to put together an interim government with a schedule for either the United Nations or the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe to come in and supervise and monitor elections in Western Ukraine in those areas that are currently Ukrainian. That has to happen. We have to realize that Zelensky, his attitudes, his behavior, his repeated violations, even of the most recent ceasefire agreement on just energy infrastructure, makes it extremely difficult for the Russians to take him seriously. I simply don't see any possibility that that would happen. Now, I don't know if that's all doable at this stage. I don't know what's happening in our U.S. State Department. I don't know what the private conversations in the Oval Office sound like. I simply know that if you left it up to the people in Riyadh, Russians and Americans, I think you would come to a reasonable solution quickly. Unfortunately, it's not up to them. There are many, many more actors involved.
Yeah, I saw the interview between Witkoff and Tucker Carlson, and it appears that there's more or less a common understanding now, at least on the key issues between the Americans and the Russians. I did want to ask you though about the proposal so far. Well, first, of course, the ceasefire, which was proposed, mediated between the United States and Ukraine, which was just a ceasefire without anything attached to it, or unclear what would happen during ceasefire or after ceasefire. But also the more recent, I'm not sure if we can call it successful, the agreement to end strikes on energy infrastructure and also have peaceful navigation throughout Black Sea of commercial vessels. But of course, some of this has already been violated, so I'm not sure if I'm answering my own question here. What was the main point of these agreements, and what is the problem with upholding them?
Well, I think President Trump expected uh, President Zelensky to honor his end of the bargain. Zelensky shows no evidence for doing so. I mean, when it came to the energy infrastructure within hours of the agreement, Zelensky launched attacks on energy infrastructure in Russia. Now, you can reach a couple of different conclusions. You can assume that Well, Zelensky really wasn't interested anyway, and he wanted to sabotage it, perhaps. You could also conclude that he does not control his own armed forces, and there are people operating now beyond his control. That's also a possibility. There's also concern about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. That's the largest one. And the Russians in particular, but also we have been concerned about Ukrainian attempts to destroy it, damage it, causing a major energy crisis. And of course, the problem of radiation and radioactivity and poisoning the environment. Those things are still in the background. I just don't know the details. I don't think any of us do at this point. So I wouldn't say that everything is at a stalemate. I think the Russians and the Americans have discovered the common ground that they can build upon. That I think is pretty clear. The problem is ultimately Ukraine. And the interesting thing here is that if you're sitting in the Kremlin, you're the President Putin or Sergei Lavrov, your expectation is that we will rein in Zelensky, that someone in Washington would say, presumably the president, that's it. Either you get on board or you're out. And I think they expect the president to be able to remove him. Now, frankly, I don't see why he could not if he chose to do so. But thus far, there hasn't been a willingness to go down that road. And I think that's the sticking point. Now, the other thing before we leave this with the British and the French, I've been reading the German press, to a lesser extent, the Polish press. But what you get from Germany is this realization now that if the British and the French actually moved forces to the east into Ukraine, which would be phenomenally stupid in my judgment, but if they did that Germany would have hundreds of thousands of foreign troops marching through their country. And obviously, the logistical strong points or concentrations, the railways, rail lines, all of these things running across Germany into Central East Europe, into Poland, would become lucrative targets for the Russians. So I think the Germans are beginning to come to terms with the reality that that's not something they want to be part of. Their government is slow to catch on to that sort of thing, but I think the population in Germany gets it. And if you look at the most really recent polling data from Poland, it's quite clear that the Polish population has turned against this war in Ukraine, at least insofar as it involves Polish participation. And I think in Washington, there is this sort of schizophrenic personality. We should get out, leave NATO. This is a disaster. We don't want to be part of it. Versus, oh, no, we're still part of NATO. And if they do go in, we can't just abandon them. I am of the view that if the British and the French are foolish enough to undertake any sort of intervention in Western Ukraine, that we should absolutely abandon them. And we should make it very clear that we will not support it. The reason I say that is that if you take us out of the equation, Glenn, there is no command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance backbone that effectively allows you to command forces across the European theater. All of that resides with us, with the United States. And when I was assigned to Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, I worked on a plan before I left that would enable the Europeans to put together what I just described, a command and control capability, a headquarters with all the supporting satellite arrays and everything else. And it was made very clear to me before I left at the time by Germans and British and French and others, listen, we think you're right. This is the right thing to do, but none of our politicians will invest a dime to do it. And I said, well, if that's the case, at some point, the Americans will leave, and then you'll have nothing. And I think that's what the Europeans know. If we pull out, there's nothing there. It has to be built up from scratch.